Order, order. Irene Campbell to move the motion.
I beg to move that this House has considered e-petition 652-602 relating to the income requirement for family visas. It's a pleasure to address you in the Chair, Mr Pritchard, in my first opportunity to present a debate on behalf of the Petitions Committee. I would like to firstly thank Shannon Corkmax, the person who launched this petition and started a very important conversation which has allowed those affected to have their voices heard today. It's a great achievement that the petition has gathered over 100,000 signatures. The petition reads, "We believe it's inhumane for the government to do this to British citizens and others entitled to family visas, and that this policy is punishing people for falling in love with someone who has a different nationality." So the minimum income requirement for family visas was introduced in 2012 and at that time was set at an annual income of £18,600. The coalition government stated the purpose of this policy was to ensure family migrants would be fully supported when integrating into the UK, while also not being a burden on taxpayer and public services. For the purposes of today's debate, the figure of £18,600 in 2012 would have been £26,250 in December 2024, based on the Bank of England's inflation calculator. So an individual needs a family visa to live with a family member in the UK for more than 6 months. The income threshold remained at £18,600 from 2012 until April 2024, when it was increased to £29,000. A person can apply for a family visa to live with a spouse, fiancé, child, parent or relative who will provide them long-term care. Spouses on the family visa can stay in the UK for 2 years and 9 months on this visa, while a fiancé can stay for 6 months. Income can be from employment or self-employment, cash savings above £16,000, money from a pension or non-work income such as property rentals or dividends. So last April, alongside a collection of other policies aimed at lowering net migration, as previously mentioned, the then government raised the income threshold to £29,000. The intention at the time was to incrementally raise it again to £34,500 and finally to £38,700 by early 2025, as highlighted in this petition. In response to this, the petitioners stated that most people in the UK don't make £38,700 per year and now may face the choice of a lifetime without their partner or leaving their own country because they fell in love and can't meet the financial requirement for the family visa. We believe it's inhumane for the government to do this to British citizens and others entitled to family visas. Yes, but I was just going to say, I'll say more about this later, but I'm happy to give way.
That's a good point then to us. I thank the honourable member for giving way. I have heard from many of my constituents who have also signed the petition as well, who say that they have struggled to have family life in the UK due to the previous government's 55% increase in the income requirement for the family visas. So this includes many individuals who work at charities or in public services, those who are giving back to our communities. So does the honourable friend agree that these unattainable requirements make it disproportionately difficult for some families to be together?
I do agree with my honourable friend, and I will say a bit more about this later on in this debate. So, yes, I'll give way.
And I'm very grateful to her for bringing this very important debate here today. Would she agree with me that the right to family life is quite rightly enshrined in Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, and it's one of the most fundamental rights any individual should be afforded. But central to this debate is the systematic inequality that exists in the current system, whether that's women who are still paid less than men due to entrenched structural pay disparities, young people who are often in the early stages of their careers and earning less as they build their futures, and those from lower income regions such as West Yorkshire and Bradford, where I represent. And she will be aware, just this morning, the Centre for Cities released a report saying those that are living in places like West Yorkshire earn £20,000 less than places like my constituency in Bradford. So will she therefore support that the The issue is before the Migration Advisory Committee, and therefore the current system should be scrapped, and the fair way of doing this is in line with the national living wage.
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention, and just to say that much of what you've raised is in this opening debate. So, since this petition was launched following the general election last summer, this government announced that the threshold would be held at £29,000 until the Migration Advisory Committee completes a new review, which is expected to be in June 2025. However, it's important to note that when an e-petition reaches 10,000 signatures, there is a government response, and I think it's important to highlight what the response was in January 2024. The then government outlined their arguments as to why the minimum income requirement should be increased to £38,700, stating this policy is part of a larger package intended to curb immigration and cut net migration. The government further added that the minimum income requirement was set with the intention that family migrants are supported at a reasonable level and to help ensure they can participate sufficiently in everyday life to facilitate their integration into British society. However, in early 2023, the House of Lords published a report called All Families Matter, an inquiry into family migration, which stated that applicants and sponsors can feel like second-class citizens and are reluctant or unable to take full part in British society before reaching settlement. The report also summarised that current migration policies are at odds with the government's commitment to family life, that they are complex and inconsistent, they fail both families and society, and that family migration rules should be simplified. I will give way.
Member for giving way. She said there about how the rules are counterproductive to family life. Does she agree with me that they're also counterproductive in relation to growing our economy? Certainly in North East Fife, my constituency, where I've had a number of signatories, the challenge is recruiting people into demand areas such as hospitality, research, dentistry. These are actually stopping the economic growth that we need. Does the honourable member agree with me?
Yeah, I don't disagree with those comments. So in response to these proposed policy changes, it's important to note that the non-profit organisation Reunite Families UK filed an application for judicial review in June 2024, supported by the Good Law Project, arguing that the rise of the minimum income requirement to £38,700 was made without analysis and in breach of critical public law duties. Many migrants' rights groups and campaigners have been outspoken against the minimum income requirement. In relation to this legal case, Caroline Coombs, the director of Reunite Families UK, who's here today, said, in the last decade, this policy has somehow continued to exist under the radar, devastating countless British and settled citizens and their partners, families and children. The general public have no idea that this policy exists until, sadly, they come up against it. Furthermore, Reunite Families found that the minimum income requirement can prevent integration of mixed nationality families for a myriad of reasons. The rising financial costs of visas and savings leads to instability, while temporary visas also make it harder to secure housing, to access education and to secure appropriate employment. It's important to note that those on temporary visas cannot claim benefits and can only access NHS services by paying into the NHS through the immigration health surcharge, and I'll say a bit more about this later. Many might say that this is an anti-family policy. Increasing the minimum income requirement can create single-parent families and puts an incredible stress on all members of the family, particularly the children. A British citizen abroad, for example, may have to return to the UK for a variety of reasons, such as a need to care for elderly relatives still residing in the UK. If the British citizen does not already meet the minimum income requirement, they may have to return to the UK alone and wait an indefinite amount of time to reunite their family. It is said that many of those returning to the UK are unable to gain employment immediately and may only begin their family visa application once 6 months of the minimum income has been evidenced. This is 1 year of income if they are self-employed. And I think it's important to note that the non-British partners' earnings are not included. If their income drops below the threshold, the Home Office application process must begin again, which can take up to 3 months itself. Statistics from the Office of National Statistics show that the value, I'm sorry I keep repeating this amount, of £38,700 is also unrealistic for most of those living outside of London and the southeast of England, given the median annual earnings for those living in Scotland is £38,500, £35,600 for those in Wales and £34,900 in Northern Ireland. Many valuable and essential jobs are paid less than £38,700 annually, and yet the people who do those jobs will be penalised for wanting to marry someone of a different nationality and are left with little to no other options to prove they would be able to support a partner. So, for example, newly qualified teachers in England start on £31,650, newly qualified nurses around £30,000, and police constables at £28,500. Also, a store assistant at Aldi, if they're making £12.40 an hour, equates to £25,792 yearly, assuming you work 40 hours a week. And an executive officer working in the department... Yes, I'll give way.
Does she also agree that £38,700 is even rarer for young people who come to this country to acquire and subsequently exclude them under this proposed threshold?
Yes, thank you. I do agree. So where was I? Yes, so so an executive officer working in the Department for Work and Pensions earns £29,500, while an administrative officer's salary in the civil service starts at £23,000. So as you can see, none of these groups qualify for the proposed minimum income requirement with their salaries alone. The Migration Observatory, an independent group at the University of Oxford, estimated that around 50% of the UK working population would be unable to qualify on earnings alone with the current income requirement of £29,000, and that 70% of the working population earn less than £38,700. In addition, the charity Reunite Families UK also emphasised that the higher value affects women more than men, who are more likely to have caring responsibilities, as well as earning less on average and being less likely to work full-time. The median earnings of UK women who work full-time are below £38,700 across all age groups, the highest still only being £35,250 for 40 to 49-year-olds. The Migration Observatory also pointed out that this new set of policies would mean that in certain circumstances, British workers in the same job as migrant workers would face stricter restrictions. For example, health professionals in the NHS who come to the UK on the health and care worker visa would be able to bring their non-UK citizen partners with them. So it's clear that these visa rules are long and complex, with many exceptions and differing prices for all circumstances. The family visa fee is £1,846 per person if applying from outside of the UK, and £1,258 per person inside the UK. These fees are non-refundable, so if the application is unsuccessful, obviously they're not being refunded. In addition to this is the immigration health surcharge. The minimum cost for adults is £2,587.50 for 2.5 years, and child costs are £1,940. So if staying for 2 years and 9 months, this then goes to £3,105 and £2,328 respectively per child. And if staying for 5 years, this rises to £5,175 and £3,880 per child. So furthermore, Reunite Families UK advise that the total cost of all these fees on a 5-year route to settlement can be over £10,000, while the cost of a 10-year route can be around £20,000. I will give way.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. Does the honourable member agree that if the government feel that some minimum income requirement is necessary or appropriate, that it should never be greater than that necessary to render the immigrant unable to claim benefits, even as Theresa May's original sum was intended to do? Thank you.
I thank the honourable member. I'm trying to interpret the question that you just asked me. I'm not sure that I agree with that or not. I'd need to really fully consider it. So I'll just continue with my statements. Thanks.
Yes, I'll give way. She continues to make an excellent case. And she's absolutely right to focus on the extortionate fees, and she raised a figure of over £10,000 that currently ordinary working families simply can struggle if they are able to pay, but simply cannot pay. And she made reference to Reunite Families UK, who do some excellent work, who have said 23% of families have to wait longer than 7 years to be reunited. Does my honourable friend agree with me that this is something that is a continued injustice? These are not stats, these are real people, and it needs to be addressed.
I thank my honourable friend. I do agree that this needs to be addressed, and I think this debate today is an excellent opportunity to do this. So it's important to also highlight that applications under the work routes can be processed in just 15 working days, yet family visas can take anywhere from 8 weeks to 12 months. So oftentimes families report requiring specialist legal advice to navigate the system successfully and to try to avoid these long waiting periods, and that's obviously going to have a financial impact as well. I don't have any cost for that. So delaying arrival does not decrease net migration, but it does increase personal and financial strain on families. It could be construed that this policy effectively views a relationship ending and a family splitting up as a positive outcome, because at least net migration figures did not rise. The Reunite Families UK survey also found the profound effect these rules have on children, with 92% of respondents saying their child's mental health had been affected. The separation which many families are forced into exacerbates these problems, putting even more pressure on the single parent. Parents report that younger children often can't understand why the family has been separated, whereas older children who understand the system become anxious for their missing parent. And it could be said that these children are growing up in a society which implicitly tells them that their family isn't welcome here. So compared to other countries, this appears to be an unusually strict family visa policy. The Migrant Integration Policy Index, who measures immigration policies in 52 countries, including all EU member states and countries in the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, ranks the UK second to bottom in family reunification policies. And many countries with strong immigration policies do not have such a high minimum income requirement for family visas. For example, Australia has no earnings threshold for family visas, while Spain and the Netherlands require yearly income to equal annual social security payments. And this highlights our current system is not the only option. In overall numbers, the percentage of family visas in proportion to other entry visas has remained low and stable at around 5%, as research last year from the Migration Observatory found. Additionally, the Home Office's policy paper, Legal Migration Statement, Estimated Immigration Impacts, published in December 2023, was unable to predict exactly the percentage of family visas that would be affected by this change, stating only that it may have an impact on the number of family migrants deterred in the low tens of thousands. So this government has stated there will be no further changes until the new Migration Advisory Committee review is complete, which is expected to be in June 2025. I hope that today I've outlined the complexities in this area and highlighted that other options could be considered for the family visa that would allow the government to control net migration while still allowing the average British citizen to marry and live with the person they love. I look forward to hearing other members' contributions and the government's response. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered e-petition 652-602 relating to the income requirement for family visas. Can I, first of all, welcome the children to the gallery? I think it's the first time that I've ever seen children in the gallery in here, so you're very, very welcome. The chair is neutral in this debate, but you're all very, very welcome. Can I, to right honourable and honourable members, say, can you please bob, even if some are, even if you are on the list, so that the clerks can make sure we get your name. At the moment, there is no time limit, but I hope that colleagues will bear in mind one another when speaking in this debate. I call Carla Denio.
Thank you, Mr Pritchard. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairship. And thank you to the member for North Ayrshire and Arran for opening the debate, and to Shannon for starting the petition. I'm grateful to be able to speak here on behalf of the hundreds of my constituents who signed this petition to highlight the negative impacts of the previous government's policy to increase income requirements for family visas. These negative impacts have been present since the inception of this income requirement, but made substantially worse by the increase. What we are talking about here is a tax on love, an ugly policy that fundamentally discriminates against migrants' families and implies that love and family reunification is a privilege that you must earn enough to afford. I've been contacted just last week, actually, by a constituent of mine who was forced to choose between being separated from his wife or moving to her home country of Taiwan. I'll quote what he wrote to me after choosing to leave. Now, in the UK, we judge people by their country of origin and the content of their wallet. If you have money, then you are welcome here. If you don't, then don't you dare fall in love with someone foreign. Is that really the country we want to be? Around half of UK employees earn less than the current income requirement of £29,000 a year, as we have just heard. And since job offers and prospective earnings for the non-UK citizens are not included, meeting that requirement is made even more difficult for many couples from overseas who just want to be together. That is not to mention the regional inequality factor, since average salaries differ throughout the UK. So your ability to love who you love may also depend on where in the UK you live and work. I do appreciate and welcome that the government has commissioned the Migration Advisory Committee to review this horrible rule, but I note with disappointment that in the meantime the income requirement remains in place. It's clear that the intention of this policy was not to benefit UK society, nor even the economy. It's simply a cruel attempt to appear tough on migration. In fact, this policy harms society and public finances. There are cases where enforced separation has caused a UK citizen to be reliant on state benefits where they would not be if their partner were allowed to live with them. There are also often costs on the NHS and social services where the trauma of families being forced and torn apart causes long-lasting mental health issues. Children in affected families are often aware of this policy and feel its impacts deeply. They report feeling sadness, loneliness and guilt, with some explaining that they struggle to sleep or struggle to focus at school. Children are also often aware of the financial strain caused by this rule, and some kids told Reunite Families UK that they were trying to earn money themselves to help with costs. The impact of this policy on children and young people can last a lifetime, affecting their mental health, financial stability and sense of belonging. No wonder why. As RFUK told the Migration Advisory Committee, this has long-term impacts on people's integration into society and their economic performance. To conclude, Mr. Chair, I'd like to reiterate that this is a cruel and nasty policy. It fundamentally discriminates against people based on who they love and how much money they make. It is unjust and it undermines its own purposes, sending an offensive message to families and their children. I urge the government to get rid of it without delay. Thank you.
Dr. Simon Over.
Thank you, Mr Pritchard, and thank you to the member for North Ayrshire for introducing this debate. I'd like to also thank you, over 300 signatures from Stroud who have made this debate possible, along with the Petitions Committee for allocating parliamentary time to this crucial debate. So the previous Conservative government hiked the minimum income requirement, as we've heard, to £29,000 and was seeking to raise this even further to £38,000, all under the guise of controlling immigration. That doesn't seem to have worked either anyway, but let's be clear about this policy and what it's actually achieved. It's torn families apart and inflicted hardship on ordinary people. So I welcome the fact the Home Secretary commissioned the Migration Advisory Committee to conduct a review on this area as soon as we entered government. So in November, I wrote to the Migration Advisory Committee alongside 25 of my colleagues calling for the family visa income requirement to be lowered to the equivalent of the full-time national living wage. This adjustment would enable thousands of families to reunite while still supporting financial stability, a compassionate shift away from the previous government's harsh stance. I am really hopeful that the committee will come to this same conclusion. Mr Pritchard, some people have sought to misrepresent the truth around this matter when discussing immigration. It's our duty to bring the facts to this debate. In 2024, the UK issued 3.4 million visas. 87,000 were family visas, which accounted for 7% of those. And of the spousal visas, they make up even less than that, less than 5%. And moreover, the narrative that foreign spouses are a burden to taxpayers is fundamentally misleading. The Home Office's own guidelines explicitly state that foreign spouses have no recourse to public funds. In fact, they contribute through taxation, as we've heard, national insurance and an annual immigration health surcharge of £1,035. I also actually worry that the cost of enforcing this policy is actually greater than the financial benefits. Families forced into single-parent situations, as we've heard, often require more government support. I've actually been seeing a patient as a GP and their family, and the children are suffering because they can't live with both their parents, and this has caused a lot of mental health difficulties. So, not only is this policy inhumane, it's economically flawed. Mr Pritchard, this debate is not just about numbers on a spreadsheet and arbitrary thresholds. It is about real human lives and love, and the human cost is immeasurable. I would like to highlight the case of one of my constituents, Rebecca Gray, who played a pivotal role in securing this debate by rallying her social media followers to help get this petition over the 100,000 signature line. In 2023, Rebecca and her husband married in Turkey and began the spouse visa application, knowing they had to meet a savings requirement of £88,500. To achieve this, they both worked 7 days a week, 18 hours a day, while living in a high-risk earthquake zone in Turkey. And despite losing 250 extended family members in the February 2023 earthquake, Rebecca persevered. But because of the UK's rigid financial rules, they remain separated with no certainty about when they can reunite. The cost of applying for a spouse visa is now a staggering £14,256, increasing regularly. The reality is that Rebecca is essentially exiled from her own country because she does not meet an arbitrary financial threshold. So Rebecca's case highlights further issues about the present policy. Rebecca is having to go through the cash savings route, which means she must hold £88,500 in savings. If you look at that, the average 25 to 34-year-olds in the UK hold, on average, about £3,500 in their savings, just going to show that this 88,000 figure is absolutely ludicrous. So, Mr Pritchard, the current policy means that family reunification is a luxury, as we've heard, only for the very richest. The £29,000 minimum income guarantee is already the highest in the world. 75% would not be able to afford this, and the £38,700 figure proposed by the government is even greater. So it is deeply unjust that many British citizens working in our NHS, in our police force and other key public services now earn too little to live with their spouse in the UK. This is a matter of basic fairness. Families belong together. When the review is published, I urge the Minister to commit to a policy that will keep families together. Thank you.
Seamus Logan.
Thank you, Chair. A pleasure to serve under you, and I want to thank the member for North Ayrshire and Arran for opening this important debate, and indeed to the petitioners for succeeding in bringing this debate today. Chair, it's remarkable to be here in Westminster Hall and find such unanimity among members from both sides of the chamber, in fact from all parties it would appear. The current income requirement for family visas simply means that in my constituency, social care positions go unfilled. The NHS struggles without the necessary workforce, and care packages are in some instances impossible to deliver, even though the funding is there. The additional money for the NHS and the overall Scottish budget is of course welcome, but money alone will not solve our problems. Let me remind members that the previous minimum salary threshold before April 2024 was £18,600, and so the increase brought in by the previous government represented a very significant increase of that requirement. Would-be migrant workers, as has already been said, are also hit by other rules, such as the extraordinary fees and the upfront health charges, which provide yet another brutal barrier. And it's not as if the stated government intention of training local people to fill these labour shortages has any hope of success. We are at virtually full employment within my constituency. Thus, the shortages in health and social care, in the farming and fishing sectors, and in hospitality and tourism. These are vital issues in my constituency, and I think the member for North East Fife and for Stroud would agree with me in that regard. This utterly unacceptable position is a betrayal and shows how vindictive the Tories were in their ill-fated and crude attempts to control migration numbers in the post-Brexit world. And remember, if we were still in the single market, we wouldn't have this issue with the free movement of people. Scotland is already suffering as a result of Westminster's Brexit and migration policies, and the old Tory and now new Labour proposals will inevitably undermine our public services. It's interesting to note that the current leader of the Labour Party in Scotland claims that he is in discussion with the Westminster Government about a bespoke Scottish visa, and in her summing up, I'd very much welcome clarification from the Minister if that is the case. As a former colleague, Stuart MacDonald, so eloquently put it last April, the government are basically saying to many of our children and to future generations, you can fall in love with whoever you wish, but if you want to marry a non-UK national and you're not earning whatever the arbitrary sum is that we decide, you will need to go and live somewhere else. You can have the love of your life, you can have your country and the right to live here, but you can't have both. That is just not normal. International students and academics make a contribution in excess of £5 billion annually to the Scottish economy. If the government recognises the contribution of international students and academics, why would they defend this inherited policy that threatens to prevent future cohorts from making a similar contribution? The SNP stands totally opposed to these current measures, never mind the increases or potential increases. And this is our motivation, and it would appear the leader of the Scottish Labour Party, for asking for devolved powers in this area. We've sought in the past to vote against these measures, and we continue to call for immigration powers to be devolved to Scotland. I say again, for the avoidance of doubt, Chair, money alone will not fix our problems. If the Labour government want to reset our relationship with the European Union, then here is one of the key areas to consider. We don't simply need to resist any increase in the earnings threshold, we need to bring it down. So in conclusion, Chair, can the Minister defend the current salary threshold and explain its logic, given that she inherited this figure? I, for one, and I am certain other members and the wider public, some of whom are watching this debate, would like to know the evidence upon which it is based. Thank you.
After Sam Mohammed. After Sam Mohammed. Yes.
It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I want to start by congratulating my honourable friend for North Ayrshire and Arran for her excellent speech, and she, alongside with other members in the room, have raised many important points. I'd also like to thank Reunite Families and the families that we have with us today. This is an issue that's of great importance for my constituents, and it's an area in which I previously worked when I was a lawyer. Chair, I start by asking the question, why the figure of 29,000? This was a question that came up many times by constituents. The previous government suggested that the new threshold would prevent families from becoming a burden to the taxpayer. They didn't define what a burden was. Presumably, it had something to do with access to public funds. However, those who come to the UK do not have access to public funds, and they've got to apply for the immigration health surcharge as well, as my honourable friend has raised. Assuming they refer to recourse to public funds, a couple with no children, with £500 eligible for housing costs, with an income of around £22,000, would not be entitled to universal credit. So again, why the figure of 29,000? In response to a petition, the previous Home Secretary made clear that their intention was to bring the minimum income requirement in line with the minimum salary threshold for a skilled worker, with no reason, no rationale as to why that threshold was chosen. Now, leave aside the fact that the UK financial requirement is amongst the highest in the world, as previous colleagues have raised. 50% of UK employees would earn less than this threshold. Now, most jobs at entry level, as previously has been mentioned, most jobs at entry level and in many industries start at the minimum wage. Minimum wage at 35 hours a week is roughly around $20,000 a year. This should be the benchmark for employment income for the minimum income requirement. So it's not clear, why are low-income workers being prevented from family reunification? As colleagues have said, are they not allowed to fall in love? Is this purely for higher earners, for the wealthy? The fact that half of UK employees would be excluded from these rules demonstrates that this policy, Chair, is discriminatory and disregards the fundamental human right to family reunification. If I may, let me share with you a story that I have been given consent to share. Her name has been changed for anonymity. Sarah works full-time in the hospitality sector and had done so for the last 8 years. Her 2 children are 9 and 11. She raised them as a single mother. She relied on her mother to help with pick-up and drop-off at school. Sarah's salary was $21,000. She went on holiday with her children and fell in love with a man while she was there. She couldn't uproot her children from school, and it wasn't viable to leave all of her family in the UK. But whilst her income was already above the minimum wage level, was not enough. The different options she'd already considered, savings she didn't have enough, she'd require $33,000, or she'd need to get another part-time job, which would be an extra 13 hours a week at minimum wage. So she started to look for evening and weekend work with the agreement that her mother would look after her children. She needed the 2 jobs, and she was quite happy to sacrifice her time with children to ensure that she met the requirements. She did. She got the job, but sadly her mother passed away. So she was left stranded with no childcare and no means of earning the extra income. Let's be clear, the real reason that the minimum income requirement for spouse visas was introduced, as previous colleagues have mentioned, was that it's just another means of the hostile environment policy. We have seen over the past few years successive representatives from the Tory government engaging in rhetoric and policies laced with xenophobic populist appeals. Phrases like taking back control and the hostile environment have created an atmosphere of resentment towards migrants. These phrases have been used to scapegoat migrants, painting them as a threat to national identity and economic stability. There is also an intersectional element, as this policy discriminates in terms of wealth, location, age, gender and ethnicity. As colleagues have said, it affects women more than men and definitely younger people. In 2017, the Supreme Court recognised that sponsors who are female or from certain ethnic minority groups are disproportionately affected by the minimum income requirement. We are talking, as my colleague has said, about 5% of the migration figures. Finally, I want to stress how important it is we get this right, as it affects people's lives. People cannot control or do not control who they fall in love with, and our policies must reflect this. Our policies should be fair, non-discriminatory and based on a proper rationale.
On that point, the Honourable Lady give way.
Of course.
I thank the Honourable Lady, and as an expert, she of course makes a powerful case here today. Would she agree with me a point that hasn't been raised in today's debate is the further complications that are then added by the further delays and the bureaucracy at the Home Office? An example of the hundreds of cases I deal with was where somebody provided their wage slips and there was a discrepancy with the money that went into his bank account and his wage slip of pennies, and that case was refused. I know the Minister is very interested in this area, and she quite rightly, and I hope she is able to address that point. And would my honourable friend agree that we need to address the bureaucracy, delay and complications at the Home Office equally?
Thank you, Chair. I agree with my honourable friend. Many cases have been delayed as a result of incompetencies, staff not trained properly, and just the constant churn within the Home Office has meant that people are just treated as numbers and not as real-life human beings that have families that need to be reunited. Chair, I come to my final points. People cannot control who they do or do not fall in love with, and our policies should be fair. They're currently not fair, they shouldn't be discriminatory, and they should be based on a proper rationale, not purely plucked out of thin air. My colleagues in this room have all made excellent points in terms of bringing the income threshold in line with minimum wage, so that people, regardless of their income, that should be the lowest benchmark on which we start, should be able to meet the threshold. As said earlier, 50% of employees currently do not meet the requirements for the employment threshold, and we should do everything that we can to ensure that everybody who is in work, in line with the minimum wage, should be able to meet the requirements. Thank you, Chair.
Ayub Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to be speaking under your chairmanship. Can I also thank the member for North Ayrshire and Aaron for opening this debate. I've got a speech here, but I think it's always interesting to just speak my mind. Hundreds of my constituents have contacted me, not just when I was elected, but prior to my being elected as a member of the House of Parliament, as a councillor. And that was when we had that relative increase to 29,000, and so many residents, constituents of mine, were concerned that they were simply unable to bring their spouses to the UK because they wouldn't meet the threshold. Many having to work more than one job, and rightly said by the honourable members here this afternoon, that people working in certain sectors just simply would not be able to meet that threshold. Apart from that, there's also a disparity when we look at people earning, for example, in London. Their incomes are substantially greater than the rest of the country. And yet, that in itself is unfair, because we all know that the expenses in bigger cities are far greater, and so someone earning £30,000 in, say, Birmingham would be able to retain maybe £15,000, whereas someone earning £40,000 in London may be only able to retain £5,000 as a contribution towards the spouse and the marriage working out within the UK. So there's enormous disparity. But let's face it, this is not about having a spouse, having a family where you can provide for them. This is not about that, because if it was, then the government would be at real odds, because if it's about affordability, well, what do we pay a couple in the UK over the age of 25? I think it's about £600 a month. And obviously there's housing costs associated to it also, but there is simply no comparison. And so this is simply a policy that was driven by the last government to feed into the narrative that we're doing something about immigration. We are going to curtail the amount of people coming in, and the one way we can do that is to increase the threshold. But that argument in itself doesn't succeed either, because the people which are wealthier or people that have assets are still able to marry and bring their spouses into the UK. So this policy would harshly affect countless British citizens who have chosen to marry partners from abroad. And we all know, and it's already been raised, the stats from the Office of National Statistics clearly identify the median annual salary in the UK falls well below that benchmark. And so it will be impossible, and people will be having to make a choice between living with their loved ones within the UK or having to leave the UK, and may find themselves in a very difficult position because they are having to leave family, work and so forth, and maybe going to a country where they just simply cannot get a job or may not have the experience or skills to take on employment. So there's enormous difficulties.
But this proposal, in essence, it's a punitive measure against those who have committed no crime other than falling in love, as already been said by other honourable members. And we know love has no borders, especially in a world of social media. And so many young people go to social media because it's a global environment where people fall in love all the time over the internet. And yet we can see that this, this particular policy will impact so many. But the Home Office, who is tasked with protecting and supporting our citizens, should not be placing barriers between families, should be supporting and facilitating unions of families. And so in seeking to protect the integrity of our borders, we must not lose sight of the integrity of our family values. I simply urge the government to reconsider the draconian measures, to remember its duty to the people it serves, and to ensure that policy reflects both economic realities and the enduring importance of family unity. Let us not punish our citizens for their choice of partner, but instead support them in building their families and lives, regardless of nationality. Thank you, Chair.
Lawrence Turner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pritchard. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. And may I also congratulate my humble friend and member for North Ayrshire and Aaron on her very capable speech to introduce this debate. I wanted to speak today on the strength of the representations that I have received from constituents, and I would like to thank all those who took the time to write ahead of this debate. I accept, as I think all my constituents would, that any government faces the challenge of striking the right balance between an immigration system that is fair and rules-based and the human right to respect for family life. And we are here today, Mr. Pritchard, because the 2012 system does not strike that balance, and the results can be arbitrary, unfair and distressing for families. As has already been said today, family life and love cannot be neatly divided by borders. And as the House of Lords, Justice and Home Affairs Committee's report said, the family visa system can be complex and inconsistent, and it drew attention to the processing delays and decisions which are sometimes very hard for constituents to understand, which have also been ably highlighted in this debate. And there are, I think, a number of examples of the unfairnesses of the policies and practices that this government has inherited. Take the inflexibility of the cut-off, which takes no account of variations in earnings across the country. There is affluence in my constituency, but by and large, wages are low, and we have not fully recovered from the closure of the Longbridge plant 20 years ago. In fact, if you were to rank all constituencies by average income, then Northfield would be 35th from bottom. In the constituency, the average full-time employee salary is about £31,000, but that does not take account of the self-employed, where wages tend to be lower or earnings tend to be lower. So that figure of 31,000 is almost £3,000 lower than in Birmingham as a whole. It is almost £4,000 lower than in the West Midlands, and it is more than £6,000 lower, or 16%, than the average for the UK. So more than half of people in work are below the current threshold, and that would rise to more than 70% under the former government's plans. So that £29,000 threshold is already an extremely challenging barrier for many families to meet, because the jobs are just not available at this point in time. Now I have constituents who are working 2 jobs or more in their efforts to meet that threshold at great personal cost to themselves. And there is a clear risk that if those inherited plans proceeded, then the right to respect for family life would have become the preserve of a fortunate few concentrated in just a few neighbourhoods within the city of Birmingham. The previous government also, I think, and I think this point was made well by the honourable membership for Sheffield Central, confused income with skill. It has been the stated ambition of successive governments to attract highly skilled migrant workers. But 2 of the constituents who have contacted me today hold doctorates, including in shortage occupation areas. But Mr. Pritchard, through a combination of altruism in their choice of career and family circumstances, they do not have large incomes. One of those constituents, Dr. Gillian Teese, is in the public gallery today, and she fought for years for her husband Patrick, who is also with us, and their children to be allowed to join the rest of their family in Birmingham. Those applications were initially refused and only granted in 2018 after significant political and press attention. Patrick is now a senior physician associate at the Royal Orthopaedic Hospital, and his application was strongly supported by the NHS. Indeed, his work in the UK is an ongoing benefit to patients and the wider community. But they had to fight to bring their children to the UK from America, and distressingly, their adoptive children, 2 young teenagers, were turned around and put on a plane at Heathrow. Gillian and Patrick are now heavily involved in the Reunite Families UK campaign, and I just want to place on record an appreciation of the way that they have responded to their ordeal by working to benefit others who find themselves in comparable situations today. And Mr Pritchard, they are not alone in Northfield. Another of my constituents estimates that he has spent £50,000 to try to resolve his wife's case. As he says, it is an exceptionally generous subsidy to airlines, hotels and lawyers. Would it not be better for the economy if that money could be spent in South Birmingham instead? So I do welcome the government's decision to ask the Migration Advisory Committee to look again at this policy. And I hope that that review and the government's response to it will take account of the House of Lords Committee's recommendation that the financial requirements should be revisited to be more flexible and to focus on the likelihood of future income of the family unit rather than solely on the sponsor's past income, to take a wider account of the whole circumstances of that family, the differences in labour markets and local wages. It focuses as well on improving the administration of applications so that fewer families are left in limbo for so long, and ultimately is fairer and more compassionate. Thank you.
Graham Morris.
Thank you very much, Mr Pritchard. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I'd also like to extend my thanks to the petitioners, those who've organised the petition, to Reunite Families UK, and indeed to the Petitions Committee for facilitating this very important debate. And also, I'd like to thank my honourable friend, the member for North Ayrshire and Arran, for opening it. And I'd like to congratulate my honourable friend for setting out the arguments and issues in a most comprehensive and understandable fashion. Now, I want to highlight a particular case that affects my constituent, but I just want to say a few general words to supplement and complement the existing contributions, which I think have all been absolutely excellent. The sharp increase in the minimum income requirement for family visas is not, in my opinion, Mr Pritchard, an ill-judged policy. It's a cruel and discriminatory policy. It makes it painfully difficult for many British citizens to live and work in the UK with their foreign-born spouses, causing completely unnecessary emotional suffering and economic strain on families. Since this policy was last debated, there's been a plethora of evidence highlighting its disproportionate impact, as we've already heard, on women, on single mothers, on those working in relatively low-waged regional economies outside of London. When the previous Shadow Minister, my honourable friend, the member for Aberfan and Maesteg, raised concerns about the lack of justification for the dramatic minimum income requirement increase, then from £18,600 to £29,000, it became clear that this decision was not grounded in evidence, but seemed, in the words of my honourable friend, plucked from thin air. While I am pleased that I'll be pleased to give way.
Thank you. Would he agree with me that one of the problems underlying this is the issue of the level of the, but also the size of the proposed increase, but also the point, just perhaps coming to there, is about the arbitrary nature of the level. One contribution already mentioned is perhaps linked to the skilled workers level, but one of the problems there is that seems to be an arbitrary figure as well. And would you agree with me that we need to make sure that people out there have faith in the system by ensuring that the system isn't arbitrary in the levels it sets?
Absolutely. I'm grateful to my honourable friend for that intervention, and I think he's absolutely correct. And while I'm obviously pleased and delighted that the current government have commissioned a Migration Advisory Service Committee review, which represents a step forward towards evidence-based policy making, the harm caused in the meantime can't be ignored. I'm aware that this review is due in June, Mr Pritchard, but in the interim, thousands of families are still separated. This policy disproportionately affects many groups, including, as I've said, women, single parents, often mothers with caring responsibilities, and in particular those outside of London and the South East. I'm especially concerned, it affects other regions as well, where there are low wages in Wales and in Scotland. In regions like the North East, where the median annual earnings are £15,000 lower than those in London, many hard-working families simply cannot meet the £29,000 per annum threshold. These regional disparities exacerbate existing inequalities and penalise those who simply do not earn as much. The Migration Observatory's 2023 research shows that 16% of British men working as employees do not earn enough to sponsor a spouse visa, but for women this figure skyrockets to 35%. This means that over a third of British women are currently ineligible to apply for a spousal visa should they innately do so. With her permission, I have her permission, Mr Pritchard, I'd like to share the story of my constituent, of Lindsay Thompson. She's a constituent who contacted me last year. She's been married to her husband Orlando for 6 years. Orlando still lives in Jamaica due to the Home Office policy. He did not meet his son, or their son, until the little boy was 2 years old, due to the pandemic and travel bans compounded by their inability to meet the mandatory visa threshold. Lindsay's a dedicated mother. She works tirelessly to provide for her son. She's applied for and secured multiple promotions at work and now only just earns £29,000 a year. Yet she must sustain this income for 6 months before being eligible to apply for a visa. She lives in constant fear that the government will raise the threshold even further. It's been suggested to £38,700, as was proposed by the party opposite, now in opposition. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I thank my honourable friend, the member for Easington, for allowing me to intervene, because many of my Slough constituents have contacted me about this very issue, with many families who simply want to be together in the UK to get on with their lives. I appreciate what my honourable friend has just said, Mr Pritchard, about the current government looking at the £29,000 threshold, and that is indeed being looked into by the Migration Advisory Committee. But does he not agree with me that the hangover from the previous Conservative government, which wanted to increase it to an exorbitant £38,700 amount in early 2025, is extremely unfair, especially when the UK average wage is way beneath that?
Absolutely. I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and he's reinforcing comments and interventions previously. He's absolutely correct, I may say, Mr Pritchard. And indeed, this arbitrary threshold, it's worse for individuals who live in relatively low wage economies like mine and others. And they're within regions, there are areas of low wages too, as has been highlighted by other honourable friends. But the emotional toll on both parents and children of this policy is immense, with long-term impacts on mental health and well-being. We must recognise, Mr Pritchard, the human cost of this policy. Families like my constituents, like Lindsay's, deserve better. Everyone has the right to a family life, whether they live in London or Easington in County Durham. It is unacceptable that regional and gender disparities in pay continue to determine whether families can live together. This policy was conceived as a desperate attempt by the previous Conservative government to reduce immigration. However, experts and campaigners consistently argue that raising the threshold has had a minimal impact on net migration figures. What it does succeed in doing is tearing families apart and inflicting unnecessary suffering. When the MAC review is published, I urge my honourable friend the Minister to give full weight to the evidence of disproportionate harm caused by this policy. Consider the voices of campaigners, of charities, of affected families who have called for a compassionate approach to immigration policy. And I politely remind the Minister that this is a Tory legacy policy which can be reversed if there is the political will to do so. So let us ensure no family is left behind and that our policies reflect fairness and respect for the right to family life.
Ewan Steinmark.
Thank you, Mr Pritchard, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. My first contribution to a Westminster Hall debate and on an important topic. I congratulate my honourable friend, the member for North Ayrshire and Arran, for securing this important debate on behalf of the Petitions Committee, and Shannon for bringing the petition forward. I want to highlight in this debate the difficulty various sectors are having in attracting and retaining workers, the risk that increasing income requirements places on these sectors, and the situation this puts families, and the importance of accessible family visas to attract people to the country. It is because young, happy and united and economically productive families are the building blocks of what we should define as a good economy. First, I welcome the Government's decision and quick decision to hold off on further increases to the minimum income requirement and allowing the Migratory Advisory Committee to assess the impacts of the recommendations. We should be led by evidence and proper process, not be forced into knee-jerk reactions to the broken migration system that is still reeling from the hammer blow of the Tories' botched Brexit deal and other factors. However, what we have currently in place punishes those on lower and middle incomes. Punished for what? They've done nothing except fall in love with somebody from another country. This not only affects families, but also risks exacerbating employment and skills challenges across the economy. When the initial decision to introduce a minimum income requirement was made in 2012, in fairness, there was a public consultation and detailed analysis by the MAC. However, no such analysis was taken when the most recent changes were implemented, leaving the full economic effects unclear. What we do know is that across the UK and in our constituencies, there are workforce shortages in industries as diverse as housekeeping, hospitality management, bricklaying, carpentry, plumbing, manufacturing and data analysis, to name a few that have approached me as their constituency MP. Up the road, 1 in 4 employers are reporting unfilled vacancies last year, according to the Fraser-Valander Institute. It is also important to note that the skilled worker visa eligible occupation list does not cover all areas facing worker shortages or sectors under pressure. A quick look at a recruitment website, which many young people trawl regularly, though I admit I've not done so since June, will show you that jobs paying below £29,000 constitute a significant proportion of the work where industry are facing staff shortages. Raising the threshold to £38,700 would substantially exacerbate this. It's difficult to see how the increase in income requirement would not deter people from making the UK their home. In my experience working in hospitality, workers coming from abroad provided immense value to that part of the economy, especially providing longevity often to businesses who often deal with a high staff turnover. A system which denies the ability for long-term partners also means that children often have to deal with one parent in the UK and one permanently abroad. Not only is this incredibly personally challenging and difficult for the child, but it also limits opportunities. Parents being forced to raise their child in a single-parent household without the support of their partner who is abroad. This places unnecessary financial and emotional pressure when, at this point, we should be supporting everyone in our community to live and work well. The final point I want to make is the importance of attracting people to live in the United Kingdom. When family reunification is made so difficult for those on lower to middle incomes, the message sent to them is they're not welcome. I know from my inbox how hard the process can be. One constituent has been waiting for 6 years to obtain a visa for their spouse, and they commented that they were left exasperated by an uncontactable and uncommunicative Home Office. 6 years. I caught myself imagining if that was your husband, wife, brother, son, nephew, niece, friend. We are deterring young and happy families under the Tories' previous policies. The negative sentiment is reflected in the UK's ranking as second to bottom amongst 56 countries for ease of family reunification, according to the Migration Integration Policy Index. This should be our gauntlet to pick up and improve upon. In the tricky business, and I acknowledge it's a tricky business, of balancing migration policy, we should be welcoming families who are ready to throw themselves and to contribute to society and building their life here. In summary, any further increases to the minimum income requirement for family visas would worsen skill shortages in vital industries like hospitality, construction and healthcare, while also making it more difficult for families to stay united. The Government's recent decision to hold off further increases is a very welcome step, and I urge them to consider the economic impact these changes would make, the disruption they cause to the families, workers and businesses when making any future decisions. Thank you, Mr Pritchard.
Thank you very much. Now come on to the front benches. Will Forster.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I want to start by acknowledging the more than 100,000 people nationally and almost 200 people in my constituency, Woking, who've signed this petition. And I particularly want to thank Sharon for starting it in the first place. They have come together to call for a fairer and more compassionate approach to family visas. This issue is one that deeply affects families across our country and is one that we must address with both care and urgency. The Liberal Democrats and I believe that the immigration system should work for everyone. We want to make sure it works for our country, but also for our economy, whilst treating everyone with dignity and respect. That means there needs to be change to the current system. Sadly, the changes made by the previous Conservative government to the income requirements for family visas have fallen far short of this goal. The decision to raise the minimum income threshold from a sponsoring partner to £29,000 a year and to propose further increases to nearly £39,000 a year has rightly caused widespread fear and anxiety for families. I think we have got to feel concerned for them. It has left countless people uncertain about their futures and forced many to make impossible decisions of their lives. Mr Chairman, there's been over 10 speakers in this debate so far, and I've heard this is a tax on love, this rips families apart. I've not heard one member speak in favour of this proposal, and I'm pleased to hear it, but the fact that no one is willing to speak for this shows this system is broken and needs changing. I think this boils down to acknowledging the humanity of the situation. Those arbitrary thresholds fail to take into account the many families who simply cannot meet them through no fault of their own. They disproportionately affect women, people in lower paid but essential jobs, and those living outside London and the South East, where their wages are often lower. I will.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. We've heard a lot about sector-specific issues, and we've heard about regional inequalities and those of race and gender. I just wondered if he would agree with me that there's also an issue with people who might have disabilities too. One of my constituents is an armed forces veteran who now suffers from PTSD and a range of other disabilities. It leaves him only being able to work part-time, so that would massively hamper his ability to hit any thresholds. So I wondered if you would agree with me that when we're talking about this, we need to make sure that we have a system that works for everyone and gives back to people who've served our country too.
Thank you, Chairman. I completely agree with my honourable friend, the member for Harrogate and Knaresborough, who highlights that this has an impact on disabled, vulnerable veterans, and the government must acknowledge that and take that into account as they change the system and ensure that they support those people. So I think he makes a valid point to support those of his constituents. My question is, despite the fact no one in this room has said they support the current policy, why did the Conservative government make this move to cause so much disparity and so much hurt? The threshold being so artificially high prevents British citizens on lower incomes sponsoring their foreign spouse or partner moving to the UK. It's not there to save money. It hurts our financial system as a government, and it hurts our economy. But it's there to make them look tough on immigration when everyone can see through it. Roughly half of the employees in the UK earn less than £29,000 per year. So I'm disappointed and surprised that the Conservatives, who've often said they are the traditional party of family values, have trashed our family values in this country by breaking up families by introducing this policy. The government's own Migration Advisory Committee is now reviewing these financial requirements. And while we welcome the pause on further rises, families need certainty, and they need certainty now. We need to know that they will not be torn apart by policies that prioritise the system over compassion. We need to protect those families. And I want to ask ourselves, what kind of country do we want to live in? A country that values the bonds of family, or one that tears those bonds apart based on arbitrary numbers to follow a statistical threshold that's been picked out from the air? Do we follow hard data, or do we follow the love that our constituents feel for each other? My Liberal Democrat colleagues and I are committed to reversing these unfair increases in income thresholds for family visas. Families should not have to live in fear of being separated. They deserve stability and the opportunity to build their lives together in the UK. I urge the government to act swiftly and halt any further increases and ensure that family visa requirements are fair and proportionate. Families matter. No one should have to choose between their loved ones and their home. Thank you.
Shadow Minister.
Thank you, Mr Pritchard. It's a pleasure to serve here under your chairmanship. I am grateful to the member for North Ayrshire and Arran, to the Petitions Committee and to the 101,321 members of the public who have requested we debate this today. Those 100,000 people have asked us to discuss this policy because, as many members have movingly pointed out this afternoon, it can be overwhelmingly important to those it affects. There are few things in life and in human nature more powerful than the desire to be with those you love. To be separated from your husband or wife by a national border is no small thing. Indeed, for those it's happening to, it can feel like everything. But the role of government is to determine what is right for the country, not for any one person, couple or family. And so we must place this discussion in its national context, managing overall migration to Britain. The public has consistently asked successive governments to lower migration. As my right honourable friend, the member for North West Essex, has said, the last government, like the governments before it, promised to do exactly this. But the last government, like the governments before it, did not deliver. Migration has been far too high for the last 2 decades and remains so. And this is not just a question of quantity. It should be a fundamental principle of our system that those who come to this country do not cost more than they contribute, that what they pay in tax should at least cover the costs of the public services they use. The policy we are debating today was implemented by a Conservative government as part of an attempt to cut migration and to ensure those who come here do not represent a net fiscal cost. Clearly, it was not enough, but it was a step in the right direction. In delaying this reform, the new government seems to be making the same mistakes that previous governments did. To refer again to the words of my right honourable friend, the member for North West Essex, we in Westminster cannot pretend that immigration comes only with benefits and no costs. This is all too clear to the country. People can see it in their wages stagnating because they're being undercut, in their rent soaring or how hard it is for their children to get on the housing ladder, in the cohesion of their communities and the pressure on their GPs, dentists and infrastructure. I will.
And thank you to the honourable member for giving way. I'm slightly surprised, really. She obviously raises a number of points about the record of her own government. So does she find it a little bit jarring that she's now preaching to the government on what they should do when they were unable to deliver it themselves?
It is the job of opposition to hold the government to account, whoever is in government, and as I have acknowledged, these are mistakes that we ourselves made. Very few people are as well qualified as we are to suggest what behaviour could perhaps be avoided in the future. That is part of our job. That is our duty to the public. I will happily.
I thank the honourable member for giving way, and I do appreciate the humane remarks that she made at the beginning of her speech. But is she not now guilty of continuing to slur migrant workers who come to this country as representing a net fiscal drain in the economy. These workers contribute to our economy, and they represent a contribution to the growth of the economy.
It is far from a slur. I will come on to more statistical analysis of fiscal cost in a moment. But if a migrant to this country represents a fiscal cost, that is a fact. It is not an insult. This Labour government, as we know, has also committed to lowering migration. We do not know how much or by when, and I would be grateful if the Minister could enlighten us today. The honourable members for Stroud and for Sheffield Central have pointed out this afternoon that spousal and partner visas accounted for only 5% of visas issued last year. But 58,000 people is still a huge number, and it is only our, to quote the Prime Minister, sky-high level of overall migration that makes it seem small. In fact, it is almost as much as the entire cumulative net migration to Britain for the 25 years leading up to 1997. In the last 4 years, more people have moved to the UK under a spousal visa than live in Exeter or Ipswich or Blackpool. And that number is rising sharply. There is some indication that as the rules around dependence and salary thresholds for work visas were tightened by the last government, people will turn to the family route instead, with numbers in the second quarter of 2024 up a third on the same time in 2023 and 4 times as much as the second quarter of 2022. It is also worth remembering that any and every Briton can marry any foreign citizen who can get a visa here. And this is a country that has issued some 5 million visas in the past 5 years. That is hardly a stringent system. The question is not, should British citizens be able to bring their foreign spouses to the UK? The question is, does it benefit the country as a whole for British citizens on lower salaries to bring foreign spouses here who are unable to get a visa any other way? By definition, those spouses fall outside the already excessively broad conditions we have set for being able to come to this country in their own right. I would also point out, I hope that it is some comfort to his constituent, to the member for Harrogate and Knaresborough, that there is no minimum income requirement if a spouse is disabled or on PIP. Mr Pritchard, the honourable members for Stroud, for Sheffield Central and for North Ayrshire and Arran have also reminded us that those coming here have no immediate right to welfare support. This implies that there are no costs to this migration, but that is wrong. After 5 years, a person who has come here on a family visa can apply for indefinite leave to remain, or ILR. If they get it, and 95% of ILR applicants are successful, they will qualify for welfare, social housing, NHS care, everything. And all of that costs money. That is why this salary threshold exists, because people who move to this country, even those who are spouses of citizens, must be able to sustain themselves financially within their family, or the whole system will fall to pieces even more than it already has. I give way.
For giving way. Just on that point in terms of a spouse costing the state in terms of public services, surely the income generated by the working spouse would mean that they are not entitled to receive benefits of any kind.
As I just explained, if they have been here for 5 years and apply for indefinite leave to remain, and it is granted, as almost all indefinite leave to remain applications are, then they are entitled to full welfare and social housing and NHS care and everything else that the state provides to its own citizens. This is especially relevant, this indefinite leave to remain point is especially relevant to family visas. 10 years after arrival, only 7%, 1 in 14, of those who come here on student visas have ILR, and 21%, or 1 in 5, of those who came here on work visas. For family visas, it is 83%, or 5 out of every 6 people. Indeed, all of this is why, when the Migration Advisory Committee conducted their initial impact assessment of this policy, they found £500 million in welfare cost savings and £500 million more in public service savings from the introduction of the 18,000 minimum income requirement. And that was when far fewer people were using that route to come here. But the cost-benefit analysis that counts is not that of the Migration Advisory Committee, but that of the British people. They want mass migration to end, and they are sick of broken promises. The numbers must come down across the whole system. The last government was therefore right to introduce this reform, and it does not bode well that this Prime Minister, for all his talk, decided at the first opportunity to back out of it. I give way.
When the government brought this policy in of punitively attacking families, could she say whether this was a successful policy that reduced migration? And also, would she say what effect immigration has on GDP?
As I have already said, this policy was nothing like enough to reduce immigration. It was a step in the right direction, but deeply insufficient. The effect that migration has on GDP in raw terms is that it increases it because you have more people here. On GDP per capita, most evidence indicates that it weakens our economy over the medium term. On this reform and on all the many other reforms required to our migration system, the government must make difficult decisions. These decisions may be painful, especially in the short term, for individual people or families or businesses or the cost of the public service workforce. But that is the only way for any government's actions to match their words. The public have had enough. Can the Minister then please confirm for us today that the government remains fully committed to bringing down migration? What exactly that means, how much they will bring the numbers down and when? That the government understands that this must happen, indeed can only happen, even where it involves making hard and upsetting choices for the good of our country. With that in mind, can the Minister please confirm for us whether it is the government's intention to maintain this policy? If they will not make that commitment today, can they at least please commit to the fundamental principle behind the policy, that those who come here or bring others here should be able to support themselves financially and not represent a net cost to the state over the long term? And therefore, does the Minister agree that the salary threshold should increase to whatever level is necessary to ensure that that's the case? And finally, Mr Pritchard, I'm conscious that those who have been granted indefinite leave to remain are then themselves able to sponsor a spouse. Can the Minister tell us, please, how many migrants on all skilled worker visas, care worker visas and shortage occupation lists, I believe this amounts to 2 million visas since the start of 2021, does the Home Office expect to apply for ILR when eligible? How many spousal visa applications does the Department then expect to receive from these people? And further, based on demographic, level of income and number of dependents, what does the government expect this to cost? What discussions are being held between the Home Secretary, the Treasury and the Department for Work and Pensions on how these pressures will be met?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Pritchard. And it is a pleasure to serve under your chairship today and to thank all of those who have contributed in this important debate, and also to thank the Honourable Member for North Ayrshire and Arran, who moved the motion on behalf of the Petition Committee. We have had a number of contributions from across the Chamber today, and I do want to thank all of those who have made their contributions, and indeed Shannon, who started the petition, and the over 100,000 who have contributed and signed the petition. And this is a petition, just to make clear, Mr Pritchard, that was concluded before the general election, but has been brought forward for debate in the House. It is important just to make a point that was raised by the Honourable Member for Bradford East around the delays in the Home Office on cases, which is a separate matter to that we are discussing today. And I do want to say that what we did inherit in terms of a Home Office with systems that were utterly chaotic, and also the huge cost, the £700 million that had been spent on the Rwanda scheme, and the diversion of caseworkers, as we had seen, was, I think, in part a contribution to the chaos that we have seen across a number of visa routes, which I hope we are now starting to bring under some control, so that applications can be processed more swiftly, and that people are not left waiting as long as they have been. I also think it's important to make the point that migration has always been a part of the history of our nation. For generations, people have travelled here from all over the world to contribute to our economy, study in our universities, work in our public services and be part of our communities. And indeed, British citizens also continue to travel across the world and may choose to make their homes abroad. And we recognise and value the contribution that legal migration makes to our country. But as the Shadow Minister and all will be aware across the House, we have said and we believe that net migration, which reached record highs under the last government, reaching over 900,000 in the year to June 2023, is unsustainable, and that net migration needs to come down. And that is a commitment that we have made. But there is a broader set of conversations that have been underlying the contributions from members from across the House. And I will endeavour to respond to the specific points raised today. But I do want to set out some of the background to the minimum income requirement, which I will refer to as MIR in the interest of brevity for some of this debate. Indeed, how it came about and what our position is now. Now, Appendix FM was brought into the immigration rules, as we know, in 2012 to set out the requirements for family members wishing to come or to stay in the UK on the basis of their relationship with a family member who is British or settled here. This also brought the MIR into the immigration rules with the aim of ensuring that family migrants could be supported at a reasonable level by their sponsoring family member. So that, as has been raised, there isn't an unreasonable burden on the British taxpayer, and to help make sure that they have the independence and means to participate sufficiently in everyday life, support themselves, and also their facilitation of integration into Britain. Now, the right to family life is a qualified right, and the family immigration rules, including the MIR, carefully balance that right against the legitimate aim of protecting the economic well-being of the UK. Now, expecting family migrants and their sponsors to be financially independent is reasonable both to them and the taxpayer. In 2017, the Supreme Court agreed this principle about striking that fair balance in the interest of those, between the interests of those wishing to sponsor a partner to settle in the UK and of the community in general. Now, when the MIR was introduced as part of the changes to the immigration rules, it was set at 18,600, following advice from the Migration Advisory Committee. At that time, the figure represented the level of income a family could receive, at which point they would cease to be eligible for income support. Between its introduction and April 2024, it was not increased in line with inflation or real wages, or adjusted in light of rising numbers of migrants using the route. The previous government then decided to raise the MIR to bring it in line with median income for skilled workers, currently 38,700. The decision was made without consultation and without the benefit of advice from the Migration Advisory Committee. Shortly afterwards, the Conservative government decided to implement the rise incrementally. The first increase to 29,000 took place in April 2024. No further changes have yet taken place. It is our view that any change must be underpinned by a solid evidence base and form part of a system that is fair, that is clear, that is consistent. To achieve this, the Home Secretary has, as has been mentioned today, commissioned the Migration Advisory Commission to review the financial requirements in the family immigration rules. This includes the level of the MIR and how it can be met. Happy to take intervention.
To the Minister for giving way. A number of members have today raised concerns about the discrepancies in incomes and average earnings across different regions and nations of the UK. Could the Minister give us an assurance that this is something the Migration Advisory Committee will be looking at?
I thank the Honourable Member for his intervention, and indeed that is what we would expect. The Migration Advisory Committee have already completed a call for evidence, and it may be of interest to the House that this call for evidence, which closed on the 11th of December, to gather views of stakeholders and those affected by changes to family rules, saw a response of more than 2,000. a record for a Migration Advisory Committee consultation. The comments received will, of course, inform the review being conducted by the Migration Advisory Committee. I am sure that many interested members or their constituents will have taken part of this opportunity to provide views because, as has been mentioned in this debate, a rich evidence base is essential to ensure that they can make effective recommendations. The Migration Advisory Committee has also commissioned out 2 pieces of research to independent research contractors, a survey with a sample of applicants to the family visa and qualitative reviews with people who applied and those who were not able to apply. Fieldwork will be starting in the next few weeks and further information can be found on gov.uk. The Migration Advisory Committee is an independent body, and I know that the review will be robust and transparent, considering the impact on family life, children, equalities and regional variations in income. It is expected that the Migration Advisory Committee will issue their report in the summer, and we will carefully consider the MAC's recommendations before making any further changes. Now, just to address a few of the points that were raised by honourable members across the House in this debate. Some members have called for us to scrap the MIR altogether. However, as I have said, it is a long-established principle that family life in the UK must be established on a basis that is balanced between the family and their needs and the UK taxpayer, and also enables family migrants to integrate into British life. The family immigration rules are flexible and contain safeguards to protect the right to family life. And it is worth just highlighting a few of the safeguards that are in the rules currently, because I think that will inform some of the contributions that were also made today. Those who cannot meet the core requirements of the rules, including the MIR, may still be granted leave if they have exceptional circumstances. That means refusing their application would be unjustifiably harsh. This takes into account the impact on children and considers their best interests too. This is in accordance with our obligations under Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, when someone is granted leave on the basis of, is granted on the basis of exceptional circumstances, they are placed on a longer 10-year route to settlement. This is granted in 4 tranches of 30-month periods, with a 5th application for indefinite leave to remain. The rules recognise some sponsors will have reduced earning capacity as a result of disability or caring for someone with a disability. Therefore, an applicant whose sponsor is in receipt of certain specified disability-related benefits or allowances is exempt from meeting the MIR and must instead meet a requirement for adequate maintenance, demonstrating that they can support themselves and their family without relying on public funds. It is right, in addition, I will take.
I thank her for giving way on that point. I think the Conservative spokesperson mentioned the point about PIP. Obviously, not every benefit, everyone who does have a disability is eligible for. There are certain thresholds and requirements in order to get those statuses of a particular disability. So I'm just wondering how, and when people who have disabilities and conditions that might vary and change, how does that factor into this?
I thank the Honourable Member for his contribution. What I will say, just in summary to that, is I'm sure that these issues will have been raised in the responses that have come into the Migration Advisory Committee, and it is right that the Migration Advisory Committee is reviewing how the current financial requirements are operating, including looking at the impact on family units. And it is, I think, important to also mention, Mr Pritchard, that both the immigration fees and the immigration health surcharge may be waived based on what the applicant can afford. I do just want to make a brief mention about those who work for His Majesty's Armed Forces in relation to the immigration rules. And it is worth noting that the previous government did lay immigration rules in March 2024, which brought the MIR for His Majesty's Armed Forces, including the Brigade of Gurkhas and the Royal Air Force partner route, in line with the Armed Forces salary threshold on the completion of training, which was 23,496 for the 2023-24 financial year. And this no longer includes an additional income requirement to sponsor a child. Now, tethering the MIR to the Armed Forces salary threshold takes into account the unique nature of their service, the Armed Forces Covenant, and also the recruitment and retention of His Majesty's Armed Forces in order to maintain national security. I don't know that the Honourable Gentleman was in at the start of the debate.
Gentleman came in quite late, I'm afraid, so I think
he's,
yes,
as always,
Minister.
welcome to catch me after the debate if he so wishes. In relation to impact assessments, the previous government published some initial analysis that was referenced in the debate today on the volume impacts of the first stage of the minimum income requirement increase in December 2023, when the decision to increase it was announced. They committed to publishing the full analysis contained within the impact assessment, but this was not done when the rules changed, nor when the general election took place. Impact assessments are important in enabling scrutiny on the impact of the increase of the MIR, and that is why we published the regulatory and equalities impact assessments for net migration measures under the previous government in September, and paused any further increases while the Migration Advisory Committee review the financial requirements in the family immigration rules. Once the MAC report has been received, a further equalities impact assessment will be completed to inform any further changes that are made. I will just come to a close, because I do believe I've run close to time, Mr. Pritchard, and just to conclude by thanking again honourable members who have contributed to this debate. The government's position is clear that we support the right to family life and value the contribution that those from overseas make to our economy, our public services, and indeed our civic life, and recognise that this needs to be balanced as part of a fair, managed and controlled migration system. I know the minimum... I will give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way. The Shadow Minister described the public's perception of these rules as being of great concern, as if there was an homogenous view across the country. And we know that's not the case. There's a different view in Scotland. During my speech, I asked the Minister to confirm if the leader of the Labour Party in Scotland was in discussions with the government regarding a bespoke Scottish visa. She hasn't answered that question yet, and I hope she will, and perhaps she could also confirm whether that might extend to partner visas as well.
I thank the honourable member for his intervention, and let me say this, that he's right that views do vary, but it is important that, in line with how the public do see immigration, that it should be a fair system, that it should be controlled, and it should be well managed, and that I think is extremely important in terms of how we look at ensuring that we have controls around our system, and not the utter chaos that we saw under the last government. And frankly, to say one thing and be doing almost the opposite is exactly what drives cynicism with politics and with control over immigration and our public services. And in relation to the comments that he has raised, I'm in contact with a number of our Scottish members of Parliament, as well as other colleagues in the Scottish Parliament. And he will know our position. He will know, because it is his colleagues that have also raised this, that we will not be devolving immigration policy, because the issues that Scotland faces are the same issues that are faced in other areas, and they are also in relation to sometimes labour market issues, whether that is on pay or it is on controls and it is on conditions. And it is important that we understand that, and that is why I also will be visiting Scotland in the near future, because it's important to hear this firsthand around the country and to have an immigration system that is working for all parts of the United Kingdom. But I know that the migration system and the MIR is an important issue specifically, and I recognise the concerns that have been raised by members on different sides of the debate indeed as well, and indeed in the many pieces of correspondence that I have received on this topic by members, many of whom are in this room today. It is why we must understand the impact of any potential further changes and ensure that policy in this area has a firm evidence base. I look forward to receiving the Migration Advisory Committee's recommendations in the summer, which I am sure will inform the next steps we take, and also inform the debate in Parliament and indeed across the country. Thank you.
Irene Campbell to wind up.
Thank you, Mr Pritchard. This debate has shown how important it is that families affected by the policy have answers soon with regards to their future in the UK. We have already heard the consequences of the long waiting times on families and particularly their children. I am proud to have represented this debate on behalf of the Petitions Committee. First of all, I would like to thank the staff from the Petitions Committee for their assistance and hard work in preparation for this debate. I would also like to thank all the groups whose work I have been able to cite in this debate, particularly the Migration Observatory, Reunite Families UK and the Citizens Advice Bureau for their guidance and extensive research, and many thanks once again to Shannon, who started this petition. We have had the privilege to hear from members contributing to this debate with varying viewpoints and ideas. It is clear that this is an issue important to constituents and the profound effect that the minimum income requirement has on families all over the UK. I finally thank the Minister for her response in giving this debate the time and care it deserves. We are all looking forward to the new Migration Advisory Committee review this year and the guidance it will provide to the Government and to all those affected by the minimum income requirement. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered e-petition 652602 relating to the income requirement for family visas. Many of the opinions say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. The sitting stands adjourned. Have a good evening. Thank you.